Welcome to Twists of Life, where every story has an unexpected turn. Stories of joy and sorrow, hope and redemption, just like the life we all live. Make yourself comfortable. It's time to begin. Arthur was clearly aware that his earthly journey was nearing its end. His seventh decade was behind him, and an incurable illness was relentlessly counting down his final days. He was a wealthy man, a descendant of an old noble family. His grandfather, though he owned an estate, was not idle. He took up shipbuilding, achieved significant success, and amassed an impressive fortune. Harsh times stripped him of his wealth but did not break his entrepreneurial spirit. Having moved to Europe, he continued his business and regained his riches. Arthur's father did not publicize his origins. He dedicated himself to science, studied history, and then taught within university walls. His mother was a musician, playing in an orchestra. Arthur grew up in an atmosphere of culture and received an excellent education and upbringing. Initially, he worked as an engineer, but in the turbulent 90s, he lost his job and was forced to start his own business from scratch. Thanks to his innate honesty and business acumen, he succeeded in construction, opened a chain of hotels and restaurants in different cities, and engaged in renting out premises. Arthur had an organic intolerance for dishonest people and profiteers. In business, he relied only on trusted partners and never deceived his clients. He managed to accumulate a considerable fortune and earn respect in influential circles. That day, he dismissed his driver and decided to walk home, to get some fresh air. His heart was constricting in an unusual way, and at times it was difficult to breathe, but the walk brought no relief. Suddenly, a sharp pain pierced his chest. His legs gave way, and he sank onto the asphalt, falling into unconsciousness. David was returning from another odd job. Money was desperately short. He had recently found work as a porter in a small hotel near the station. The pay was low, but sometimes he got tips, and every ruble counted. 30-year-old David was raising 3 children. His youngest daughter, Susie, suffered from cerebral palsy and required expensive treatment and rehabilitation. Upon arriving home, he would have dinner and immediately go to bed. He had no strength left. All the childcare fell on his wife, Sarah. He loved his quiet, gentle Sarah very much. She never complained, only faded before his eyes, becoming paler and thinner. Maybe he should find another job. Engrossed in his somber thoughts, David didn't immediately notice the figure of an elderly man sprawled near a bench. People hurried past, indifferently avoiding the person lying there. Who knows? Maybe he'd been drinking or something else. David tried to lift the man and seat him on the bench, but he was motionless and didn't regain consciousness. 2 more women approached. Together, the 3 of them carefully laid the old man on the bench, placing a bag under his head. The women called an ambulance, while David unbuttoned the collar of his shirt and began searching for a pulse. Fortunately, the ambulance arrived quickly. David decided to go with the stranger to the hospital, to help, as he had no identification on him. The man's face seemed vaguely familiar to him. The man was admitted to the hospital without any identification. David knew nothing about him, but he felt genuinely sorry for the old man. Everything pointed to a heart attack, and there was no way to inform his family. The young man decided to visit him as soon as he regained consciousness and wrote down the hospital number. Despite his busy schedule, David called every day to inquire about the elderly man's condition. The patient had undergone heart surgery. 3 days later, he regained consciousness, although he was still very weak. David bought cookies and fruit and went to his room. "Was it you who brought me in?" the patient asked with a slight smile. "Thank you so much, from the bottom of my heart." They got acquainted. Arthur didn't want to worry his family. His wife and children were away on vacation. The man asked David about his family and work. The elderly man had a kind face, he was a good listener, and David, unexpectedly, told him about his difficulties. The hotel where he worked part-time turned out to be well known to Arthur. David complained about the meager salary and the rudeness of the staff. "Arthur, I think I've seen you somewhere before. I just can't remember." "It's a small world. Anything can happen, and we'll definitely see each other again. After all, you saved my life. The doctor said another half hour, and it would have been too late." "Oh, nonsense. Any normal person would have done the same," the young man said, embarrassed. He felt as if he was talking to someone very close, like a father or an uncle. "That's the trouble. There aren't that many normal people left," Arthur replied sadly. They parted as friends, exchanging phone numbers. 2 weeks later, David was completely astonished to see Arthur at the hotel. The entire staff was bustling about, wiping away every speck of dust, polishing door handles until they shone. This didn't happen often. The owner himself had arrived. The staff were particularly surprised when the owner approached David with a smile and shook his hand warmly. David, not at all flustered, inquired about Arthur's health. The next day, the manager offered the young man a position as administrator, but he refused. He had never had to manage others. On the contrary, he had always been yelled at, hurried along, even mocked for his modest clothing. Arthur had been married to a young beauty for several years. They had 2 sons, whose upbringing was handled by his wife. The businessman's wife was denied nothing, loved to shine in society, and traveled frequently. Their relationship had long become formal, purely businesslike. His wife returned from trips in a wonderful mood, but never spoke about the time spent away. Arthur understood that he was no longer young, but there was no warmth in their communication whatsoever. He also had a son from his first marriage, who lived in America. Sometimes they would call each other. His son was nearing 50, ran a successful business, and lacked nothing. In short, despite having a family and fortune, the elderly man felt very lonely. In his youth, he had friends, but their paths diverged and communication ceased. The unexpected help from a stranger touched him deeply. He sensed genuine kindness, empathy, and a certain inner core in the young man. Therefore, he very much wanted to help this good person escape poverty. But how to do it, he didn't know. David would never accept help for nothing. Early one morning, there was a knock at David's apartment door. Arthur stood on the threshold with a bag of fruit and sweets for the children. "Decided to drop by, visit you, and thank you again. Will you offer me some tea?" David introduced his new friend to his wife and children. It turned out the family knew nothing about what had happened, and the rescued man happily recounted the heroic deed of the husband and father of the family. Sarah, wiping away tears, assured him that her David simply couldn't have acted otherwise. The children eagerly declared that their dad was the best and a true hero. It was clear how much the children loved their father. Everyone was touched, and David blushed with embarrassment. The guest was invited to the table. He took out delicious pastries and fruit, treated the children, praised the hostess for the tea, and even played with the little ones with toy cars. Then Arthur offered David a job in his company, initially as a manager, but with prospects for growth. The sum mentioned stunned David. He thought he had misheard. He had never seen such money, not even close. It felt awkward to refuse, so he agreed, although he doubted if all this was happening in reality. The guest stood up, preparing to leave, and at the door added, "Here's my business card. Start work tomorrow and quit all your current jobs today. You'll start a serious career, you'll be able to help yourself and your family, and get Susie the treatment she needs." "How can I do that right away? I don't know anything," David said, frightened. "Don't worry, we'll teach you," Arthur smiled. You'll be on probation for a month, getting half your salary. David agreed, thinking that this half was several times his entire current earnings from all his odd jobs, several times over. That night, he couldn't sleep for a long time, while his wife Sarah carefully ironed the collar of his wash shirt so her husband would look presentable at his new job. The next day, the young man went to the office. He was terribly nervous, afraid of not living up to expectations, and the boss, Arthur, was already at the main office of the company. He personally showed the new employee around the offices, introduced him to colleagues, presented him as his friend, and promised to personally brief him on the specifics of the manager's job. The boss commanded enormous respect, so the modestly dressed newcomer was received kindly. He was immediately hired in the HR department and even offered an advance. He needed to buy business attire. A month later, a completely different David appeared before the employees, trim, in a good suit, with a confident look. The young manager turned out to be not just sharp, but also remarkably driven. He quickly mastered all the intricacies of the profession, the procedures for documentation, and methods of interacting with clients. Soon, he surpassed other employees and became the company's leading manager. David worked hard, often staying late. 2 years passed. David achieved great success in his career, becoming the company's managing director. He no longer had to ask colleagues for advice. He was perfectly capable of handling all matters himself. Despite this, the young man didn't become arrogant and maintained excellent relationships with the staff. His connection with the boss became truly warm and friendly. They often visited each other's homes. Their children were roughly the same age and enjoyed playing together. Arthur completely trusted David, treating him almost like a son. David's family life changed dramatically. He bought a car, acquired a new spacious apartment near the office, and hired a nanny to help his wife with the children. And his youngest daughter received the necessary treatment and rehabilitation at a specialized center. Her illness gradually receded, becoming almost unnoticeable. Susie was now walking confidently on her own. Her parents rejoiced at every step she took and were immensely grateful to their benefactor. One day, the boss invited the managing director to his office and offered him full control of the company during his absence. He was going to Germany for treatment, possibly requiring heart surgery. David agreed. He had already managed the firm several times during the owner's business trips. Soon, sad news arrived from Germany. Arthur had passed away during the operation. The managing director gave the necessary instructions and, shaken, went home. Tears streamed down his face. His wife Sarah also cried, and then Susie did too. She had become very fond of Grandpa. Moreover, it was unknown how the heirs would handle the company. Most likely, he would have to leave the job he loved. A few days later, David was invited by the notary for the reading of the will. David was puzzled as to what connection he had to his boss's inheritance. On the appointed day, the young man arrived at the specified address. Several people he didn't know were already in the office, as well as Arthur's wife. The will stipulated that the apartment, country house, and financial capital were left to his wife and children. The entire empire, the company, the hotel chain, the office buildings, he left to David, a man who, in his words, had given him several extra years of life and was the only one capable of preserving and multiplying the business to which Arthur had dedicated himself. Everyone present's eyes widened in astonishment. David himself was so stunned he couldn't utter a word. The young man had always believed that Arthur had taken him on out of pity, thinking he had made his career only thanks to the owner's kindness. But he could never have imagined that his boss would leave him his entire business as an inheritance. David left the office feeling numb and immediately went home. "Sarah, can you believe it? I got an inheritance from the boss." "What inheritance?" Sarah didn't immediately understand what her husband was talking about. The owner left me the entire company with all its branches. Me, a simple porter. Oh, David, you're so talented. That's why Arthur valued you. Sarah wiped away a tear. He was such a good man. I'm very lucky to have you, Sarah. The couple hugged and sat down to drink tea together. After this, David was dragged through the courts for 6 months. The deceased's relatives even tried to prove that the owner was insane, but these claims were not confirmed. The young man himself was ready to renounce the inheritance, but the notary handed him a note from Arthur, where he explained his decision and asked him not to yield to provocations, because his relatives would ruin the work of his life, while David would be able to continue it. When the lawsuits ended, he became the rightful owner of the vast company. Thus, one act, dictated by heartfelt kindness, forever changed the fate of a simple man.